Hello and welcome to the Washington Urban Debate League's Junior Varsity Video Series. In this video, we'll talk about the state's counterplan. First, we'll give an introduction to the argument and then break it down into the individual pieces. Next, we'll extend the counterplan throughout the debate and then talk about answering the counterplan as part of the affirmative. So when I say the state's counterplan, what am I talking about? Well, let's go over some of the basics. The United States has a federal government in Washington, D.C. that makes broad policies for the entire country. Some examples include making foreign policy, addressing general taxes, healthcare, etc. We also have state governments in state capitals that deal with regional matters such as environmental quality and infrastructure. We also have local governments such as mayors and county commissioners that make decisions about local issues, from traffic lights and recycling campaigns to, in some cases, your local schools. There are many areas of overlap where different levels of government can take action on similar issues. This counterplan asks the fundamental question: is the federal government the best actor to do the plan, or would it be better if state governments did the plan? When it comes to education, the chart on the right can tell you that states are the key player in education policy. State governments can do many of the things the federal government can, and many argue that they can do some of the things much better than the federal government. The first piece of the state's counterplan is the counterplan text. This must be a formal statement of what you believe should happen. It should be held to the same high standard as the affirmative plan text and cannot be changed after you read it in the first negative constructive. It should say, each of the state governments in the 50 states should, and then you insert the rest of the plan. This means that every single state government will do the plan in the same way, giving the counterplan solvency. As you know, a counterplan isn't just another way to do the affirmative. It's a test of whether the part of the plan is a good idea. The counterplan must be mutually exclusive with the plan. Essentially, you can't do both, or at least there must be good reasons why you shouldn't do both. State governments and the federal government can both take action on education policy at the same time, aka doing the plan. While this might seem to duplicate effort and be a little wasteful, this isn't mutually exclusive on its own. Therefore, the negative needs to win a net benefit, or reasons why the state action is better than federal action, or why federal action is bad. Just like the plan, the counterplan has the responsibility to argue that they are capable of solving the problems identified in the first affirmative constructive. They need to show that the state governments can implement the plan without the federal government. There are two arguments that should be made here. First, that states are good at implementing education policy and are good at experimenting with different policies to discover best practices. And second, that the states are able to specifically solve the issue identified in the first affirmative constructive. Be as specific as possible here. Quality evidence is better than quantity in this case. Lastly is the net benefit. If the affirmative wins that the plan solves, and the negative wins that the counterplan solves, how does the judge decide between these two equal propositions who wins? The affirmative will argue that we can do both, and they will likely be correct to some degree, meaning that the affirmative could win the debate. However, if the negative has a compelling reason why you cannot have state and federal action together, and that the counterplan is better than the plan, then the negative will win the debate. This usually comes in the form of a disadvantage that links to federal action, the plan, and doing both, but not the counterplan, the state government action, alone. It's important to specifically explain what the net benefit is and how it works. All three of the WUDL disadvantages can be net benefits to the state's counterplan, even at the same time if you want. Let's walk through it. The spending disadvantage talks about a trade-off in spending at the federal budget. The state's counterplan, acting alone, doesn't spend federal money, preventing a trade-off at the federal level. The federalism disadvantage was written to be the net benefit for the state's counterplan. It talks about how federal overreach is bad for this country. The state's counterplan, acting alone, avoids this federal overreach if the federal government isn't involved. Lastly, on politics for varsity, this argues that there are negative political consequences for sending the plan through Congress. If the plan goes through the states, the counterplan, it doesn't involve the Congress, avoiding political backlash. So how do you use the state's counterplan to win a debate? Before the first negative constructive even begins, write a specific counterplan text specific to the affirmative during the cross-X period. During your first negative constructive, read the counterplan text, explain how the counterplan competes or is mutually exclusive, explain how it can solve the problems pointed out in the first affirmative constructive, and then identify and read a net benefit or benefits to the counterplan. Make sure to not take too much time doing this. Reading a counterplan should only really take 2 or 3 pieces of evidence in the first negative constructive. This means it should only take you about 2 to 3 minutes to read maximum, giving you plenty of time to make other arguments and to add net benefits. First, let's talk about using the counterplan in the block. It's important to give an overview of the counterplan at the top. Here's an example. The state's counterplan is a better way to solve the plan. We can solve the same problems as the affirmative while avoiding reasons why federal action is bad, making the counterplan preferable to the plan or preferable to attempting to do both together. First, focus your arguments on the do both argument made by the affirmative. This is a challenge to bet if the counterplan is competitive. If any do both arguments made by the affirmative add new actions that are not in the plan or in the counterplan, it is called intrinsicness. If the affirmative can just add new ideas later in the debate to smooth out any problems you point out, the negative could never win the debate. Similarly, if they make do both arguments that do not include all of the plan and all or part of the counterplan, they are changing their initial proposal, the plan, and, quote, severing out of their initial argument. If they can stop defending the parts of their plan that you object to, the negative could also never win the debate. These are theoretical reasons to reject the do both argument. And if they try to go for this argument at the end of the round, this is a reason to vote negative because the affirmative is cheating. Secondly, be sure to extend your solvency. Take a moment to explain in your own words how the counterplan can solve each of the advantages of the plan and answer any no solvency arguments from the 2AC. If there are reasons why the counterplan may not quite solve all of the affirmative, that's okay. Explain how these aren't a big deal and how the net benefits, the disadvantages that link to federal action and not state action, are a bigger deal. Third, extend the net benefit. Identify what they are and make sure they are still perceived as reasons why the counterplan is better than the plan. Lastly, make sure to answer any offense against the counterplan. In the 2NR, it's important to focus on one argument. First, you'll have to remember to extend the counterplan and a net benefit, a reason why the counterplan is better than the plan. Give an overview of your position and explain how the counterplan solves the case. Answer any arguments extended from the first affirmative rebuttal, no solvency arguments, do both arguments, offense against the counterplan, etc. And lastly, spend the rest of the speech winning the net benefit, or at least at the risk of the negative consequence of doing the plan or trying to do both is bigger than any solvency deficit from the first affirmative rebuttal. So how do you answer the state's counterplan as the affirmative? As with any counterplan, it's important to remember SPOT, solvency, permutations, offense, and theory. The negative is suggesting that 50 U.S. states and the territories are going to be able to work together and execute the same plan as the federal government at the same level of quality, maintaining equality and accountability for all. I don't know about you, but this seems pretty unlikely to me. So you should point out that that just isn't going to happen. States are often broke, so if the plan is expensive, they may not be able to solve, or that only certain states will be able to actually pay for the plan. States have a history of doing many of the affirmatives poorly. There are reasons why states are bad at a lot of the ideas and why the plan is being suggested as a federal action, especially when it comes to preserving equity, quality, or to afford the plan. Implementation often requires oversight, a role that the federal government can play well. And also, there are places, such as military bases, the District of Columbia, Native American reservations, just to name a few, that states cannot solve for, creating solvency deficits in this state's counterplan. Next is the permutation, the do-both argument. This is a key part of any affirmative strategy against any counterplan. Especially when it comes to education, most plans are probably best done with some combination of federal and state action. The federal government can provide things like oversight, ensuring equity, equality, accountability, and quality. They can also provide needed funding, giving states to implement locally oriented solutions they couldn't otherwise afford. Sometimes the net benefit, the disadvantage to federal action, would also link to state action, meaning you can or should do both. This is a reason why the counterplan might be worse than the plan. States experience funding trade-offs too, and their budgets are smaller, so the trade-offs might be worse, especially since most states are not allowed to run deficits. State action can also extend federalism too far in the other direction. State action can also cause political backlash, either because of the substance of the plan or because the federal government is seen as passing the buck, abandoning their responsibility to act. Let's talk about offense. State governments aren't perfect, and there are disadvantages to state action which can be compared to the benefits to help the affirmative. Some of them are solvency deficits that can be explained offensively. Unequal implementation or a lack of equity is functionally sexist, racist, or potentially discriminatory in other ways. The negative gets the same assumption that the counterplan text becomes law that the affirmative gets when it talks about the plan. They don't get to change the racist attitudes and generational legacies of inequality in certain parts of the country with the writing of a counterplan text. States have a history of segregation, especially in education, making it easy to believe that they won't implement the plan well or equally. Trade-offs in state budgets are a great opportunity for further research. States can't run deficits, unlike the federal government, ensuring a budget trade-off. Lastly, setting a precedent of state-based education could lead to other unintended consequences. The WUDL file includes a disadvantage that, left unchecked, states will begin to teach climate denialism, preventing us from solving global warming. Lastly, let's talk about theory. The affirmative gets one actor, the federal government. Is it fair that the negative gets 50? If you're the affirmative, you definitely should object to that. Second, this isn't a real-world solution. California and Alabama won't pass the same education policy, and if they do, they won't be able to implement it in the same manner. Furthermore, it's unfair to have to research 50 potential negative actors versus one affirmative actor. There are alternatives to this unrealistic counterplan the negative should read. If you give examples like the court's counterplan, it can help make your case, so they aren't at a competitive disadvantage. And lastly, they've already read the argument, and we've built our speech and allocated our prep time accordingly. Even if they drop the abusive state's counterplan, it has still disadvantaged the affirmative and is a reason to vote against them.